Hello and welcome to this episode of Sansad TV, in which we're looking at a subject which has more recently come into the news, both before the budget and after the budget, primarily because India's defense expenditure is something which is looked at carefully by both India's friends and adversaries. And more recently, figures that have begun to do the rounds are about how India's armed forces have begun to look at the possibility of more and more absorption of indigenously manufactured military platforms and equipment. At the same time, we have now come out in the open, as it were, after many years of hesitation, to start selling state of the art lethal military technology. And we have two informed and authoritative experts who will help us understand these issues better. We have with us Lieutenant General A.S. Lamba, former Vice Chief of the Indian Army, and by virtue of that appointment, he was head of the Defense Acquisition Council or initiatives as far as the Army was concerned, and a man who has since then donned the academic hat, is president of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, but is also a commentator on issues related to defense and security. And we have with us Mr. SP Shukla, who is the president of the Society of Indian Defense Manufacturers, which is a large body and which has its own concerns about how much they plan to achieve and if they are being provided a level playing ground. And I'll go to you, General Lamba, sir. The fact that the armed forces have clearly indicated that they are already looking at absorbing above 60% of their military requirements through indigenously produced military platforms. And this could go up next year to 68% and keep rising. Now, the issue of concern to me is that in all these years, the armed forces have always indicated that what they need can only be found abroad because of the state of art technologies that is being produced by other countries. And for some reason, our defense industrial complex was not meeting their expectations. Why was that the case then? And how is it suddenly 2/3 of our expectations can be met locally?
Maroof, you have two very good questions in this. One is, what percentages? I mean, the gist of it all is, why were we spending so less? Why are we here we are today? And how do you think this can be made up? Is something I will extrapolate the question to. First part, I think the biggest slippage in our history has been that we have never relied or co-opted or integrated the private sector with trust and with the full information. When we make a long-term perspective plan, we make it for 7 years, but it doesn't transform. It transforms to the PSUs or the government sector. Till it goes into the civil sector, the private sector is not even sure what you want. So the biggest gap, the void has been the interface or the connect between the civil sector knowing what you need 7 years hence, which is an indicator this is what way we need to take our country to. Along with that is about budgeting. The budget of last year, 4.78 lakh crores for the defense budget of 2021 is just remains at the old slots of where it has been in the last 10 years. If you want to be a security provider, regional and a global pair, we will have to step out from these self-inflicted limitations of sticking to these percentages of GDP or a budget, whatever you have. You will have to step out of this. And finally, just because, like you asked me yesterday, just because now we are willing to push the integrated private sector into it, is it happening because of that? Or what is the reason? How is it happening suddenly that we have the BrahMos out and we are looking at an array of exports? I think your question yesterday and today is very pertinent. The will was always there. The national competence was always there. I think where we were lacking was the convergence of the system, the political will, and the defense capability was all being underplayed. They were being dealt with in three silos. Today, what we see in the last 3 to 4 years happening, there is a convergence, a visible convergence, where we are having the political will, the capability, and the perspective planning put together. I see this as the new trend. If you and India would have to look at, for example, not today. If you look at what the budgeting should be in the next, let's say about 2030, it will be a mark to set to say we need to grow there and not look at small issues and root.
Well, that brings me to my second question. And Mr. Shukla, I think you will be able to enlighten us on this issue. I think there are two or three factors with regard to the role of the private industry in defense production. There has been on and off the mention of how far can we involve the private industry, and why can't the huge setup that we have in place in terms of the defense public sector undertakings, the ordnance factory boards, why can't they meet the challenges? Because the government has, since independence, given them all the support they need. So where is the stumbling block? Why is the private sector not being involved? Because one has seen in the case of the Western world that top-end military platforms, whether it's fighter jets, whether it's artillery systems, whether it's radar systems, whether it's even space-related material and missile systems, by and large, it comes from their private sector, with the exception of maybe a country like the Russians. So where do you feel are the blockages? Is there a battle of turfs of interest? Is it that national interest is superseded by interest of organizations who want to control the monopoly on things? Because clearly, if the aim is for India to become Atmanirbhar and get to where the Prime Minister and so many others have expressed the vision for, then we have to involve every top-end element that is in the country, not just leave it to a handful of people who, I'm sorry to say, have not lived up to the expectations.
Thank you, Maroof. You have actually asked three questions, so I will take them one by one. First question, why private sector has not been there? It is difficult to answer because this started before even I was born, in the 50s, just after independence. For some reason, at that time, government decided that it was reserved for public sector, and several public sector units were created dedicated to producing one platform or the other platform. They mostly produced under license from foreign manufacturers, and general policy used to be that certain number of units will be directly imported from outside India and rest will be produced under license. Unfortunately, license did not have a provision for either upgrading or bringing out next generation of the equipment.
Okay.
Outcome of this policy was that while we could produce that many pieces, that many units of either tanks or aircrafts or helicopters, whatever you name, but once you completed the license arrangement for that many units, your license was over and you had learned how to make, but you did not perhaps know why something was done that way. How to do is different from why. This why part is very important part. That is what we call R&D. Know-how is just learning how to do it. So it is one thing to say that produce under license, another thing to say having that innate ability to design and develop. So the first part of the question is that. Second question, why could not in the past we come up to the challenge of giving cutting edge technology at efficient production rates and prices? Well, when there is a monopoly of any platform by one unit, there will be certain element of complacency. So I
True.
would not go too much into it. All this is before my time. What we talk about is question 3, what is being done today? And that is what I would like to focus upon. In last few years, there has been a tremendous focus on Make in India as well as involvement of private sector. Second, I'm happy to say that if you look at the latest DAP 2020 Defense Acquisition Policy, it has a very important provision, very important chapter on strategic partnership model. What is the objective of strategic partnership model? It envisages that for every major platform,
Hmm.
there will be at least 2 manufacturing lines in the country. If one already exists in the public sector, then second will come up in the private sector. Now comes the how part. How will a second line will come up? The strategic partnership model envisages that Indian companies, and they will have majority stake, at least 51%, will have a joint venture with foreign OEMs so that together the joint venture will absorb the technology, bring in Indian perspective, Indian cost efficiency, frugal engineering, and JV will become a second manufacturing line for all the major platforms. What is listed are major platforms listed are aircraft, helicopters, submarines, ships, etc. So there will be a second line in private sector in the country. What it will achieve? Two things. One, it will provide competition to any one unit in public sector which currently has a monopoly on that subject. And two, it will allow us to have a bigger funnel to absorb technology. If only one unit, I will not name any, one unit for particular item has license from UK for one particular brand of products, with France with another, with America with third. First of all, the countries themselves are little concerned that we are all going through the same company and will our technology be protected? And second, of course, ability to absorb technology. We call it funnel. That becomes restricted because now same company is being told to absorb technology from different companies in different countries from whom you have bought products in 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s at different times. Having another unit allows you to broaden your funnel and they can tie up with a new company and have technology transfer, create a joint venture. So I would say the strategy has been thought out well. It started in the time of late Parikar Sahab, and it is put in place. And government is progressing and taking steps to invite EOIs and RFPs under this. Sooner we do this, we will have very proudly a second manufacturing line in private sector for every major platform, which will not create competition to existing public sector units. And that competition will lead to both pressure on quality, pressure on upgrade to new technology, and pressure on keeping cost low. All
Okay.
three objectives will be achieved through this policy.
Okay, so that's comprehensive enough. It's a good window into what DAP 2020 talks about and how we are going to go forward. Uh, Unfortunately, I feel very often we become victims of the policies we've written with good intent. And we end up saying, oh, the policy doesn't permit, so how do we move forward? Then you go back to the drawing board again, unless you have a leadership in place which says just get on. And that's what I'd like to ask General Lamba, sir. Military equipment purchase is a very time consuming affair, but to create new verticals within your country is probably 3 times more time consuming. So it brings us to the central question that how do you balance critical requirement needs to be attended to with the overall agenda of the country to become self-sufficient?
Right. Maroof, very relevant questions. I'll take the last two statements, which are very important. You had left me on a tag, does the country have a vision? There is a vision that's been printed out by the present government. And in the opening lines, I have read very recently, it said, India must be a leading nation by the first quarter of this century. Right. It leaves it at that. When you go on, and I'm translating it, when you go on to the defense production, which is the entire challenge, and I hope what is written in that document is, if I recall, giving the private sector a larger role in design and manufacturing of military hardware and platforms, both domestic use and exports. The second is focusing on cyber technology. Third, investing heavily in space programs. And finally, forging strategic partnerships that are not limited either in terms of trade or defense, but are all comprehensive. Now, this is relevant to understanding where we are. This is the background vision, a leading nation, and this is the four strategic, approaches that the government wishes to take. What is happening on ground is what your question is today. And you asked me, the model explained by Mr. Shukla, that we have expertise with one nation and we can build it. This went on to be considered in the last TPP 3 years ago. It stood 23 countries, 23 firms were identified. Somebody for submarines, somebody for ships, somebody for technology, somebody for guns and armor, somebody for aircraft. It didn't work out. No matter what the test had been done by the study, I felt it had a counter narrative. It was like leaving out the SMEs, leaving out the SDIC, leaving out all the competitors who would have given their best technologies at a price much lower than what it costs the government today. So I think this was a model that was done after a lot of study but never succeeded. So what do we do hereafter? I think the journey has begun at the government level and at the level of the defense manufacturers. There has to be an approach that deals not with their production as defense share, but as an integrated consortium that deals on a model how to take the country forward. Till every civil defense manufacturing, and we have about 9 giants with us, this signature has to convert into a convergent approach. How does the defense sector play its role? If India looks at it differently, it's by force of competition. And you rightly said, you change one vertical and you have 3. You've added 3 times the time. It'll add on to cost, which is invisible. It'll move into a domain that you cannot correct. So I think the 2-line answer, Maroof, is one, that we identify the point of security capability in a LTTP, which I'm sure is the one for 2025 or 2027, as I recall. We must be very clear. What we want is not only designed and made by us, but made in consultation with these 9 or 10 giants and the new coming up companies. Having done that, the whole nation is then accountable. The government system and the manufacturing sector, that's the private sector, to ensure that this potential envisaged 7 years ahead of time is actually met. How many verticals? No, there should be no distraction from a central approach where we can do this. The overall readiness only then can be achieved when we are on the same page.
Okay, well brought out, sir. I think where I need more clarity, and I'm going to ask Mr. Shukla to give us that as the head of the Society for Indian Defense Manufacturers, I'm sure you're aware of the example of China, which in a short time, from being one of the world's largest importers of military platforms, like India continues to be, but China isn't. China has become amongst the top 5 defense manufacturers in the world. And one reason I would attribute for China's success in this area is that China has a captive market. The captive market is in Pakistan. So when Pakistan has taken what it could from the US, it weaned itself away. And today, Chinese equipment is all over. In fact, Chinese equipment is also more than 75%, as I'm told, even in Bangladesh, which we have all the geographical advantages of it being next door. We have emotional and other historical advantages, but we haven't moved. And linked with these two aspects is my question: where is our captive market? We tend to claim that we have demands from Egypt, we have demands from some EU countries like Spain and Italy, and even France and Russia, who are huge defense manufacturers themselves. We have some demands in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, I'm told. But more recently, the sale of BrahMos missile, which is not a private initiative, but an initiative of the DRDO, BrahMos, DPSU, and Government of India and Russia. So can't the private sector, instead of waiting for all doors to open up, just get on with manufacturing things where we may have captive markets? It doesn't have to have the rubber stamp that is manufactured by the government DPSU.
Maroof, very interesting question. What is captive? First captive market of China was not Pakistan. First captive market of China was China. Let us understand exports in any product category. Let's not worry about defense. Let's talk any product category.
Mhm.
Exports require you to be competitive. Your cost has to be competitive with others. You will find the largest exporters in the world, any company, first and foremost has largest captive market in their own country. If you look at car exporter and you say US and Japan, the truth is US and Japan are also the largest car markets of the world, and therefore their companies build up their efficiencies, their scale of production by first having large mega plants which produce for domestic market, American or Japanese, and then it goes out to rest of the world. If you talk about mobile handsets, first markets were America, Japan, European community, and therefore largest producers were in those countries. When you export a certain fraction of your production, domestic production. And generally, people talk about that company exports 10% of his production, 5% of his production, 15% of his production. Economies of scale, as well as ability to invest in the plant, ability to continuously upgrade the technology comes from domestic market. The first market, captive market word if you want to use, is always in your own home country, and then you supply. Now you go to customers. Who are your customers? The customers' first question they ask, have you sold to army in your country, navy in your country? When we buy a fighter aircraft, first we want to know, is Air Force of your own country using it, or you are saying I will make it only for you? So when we talk about Chinese equipment going to Pakistan or other countries in the region, first and foremost, they were bought by Chinese army itself. And then only that, so if you made 1 lakh rifles for Chinese army, then 10,000 could easily be exported for Bangladesh, Pakistan, and others. So first principle of export market is to achieve economies of scale, because now you are competing with the world suppliers and you have to be more cost effective than others. So if you do not have domestic market and you only intend to export, then it becomes an uphill task. Captive market begins at home, then you get other captive markets.
So, Mr. Shukla, you've made a very important point, but I think there is a bigger issue. The issue is that the captive market in India has never emerged in the scale that it should have for us to be able to export because of a disconnect between the end buyer, that is the armed forces, and the potential supplier, that is the Indian defense public sector undertaking. One says that it takes too long to produce these items, and therefore we have reached critical necessity of getting the military equipment. Otherwise, we might not be able to secure the country's borders. And the other side says that any R&D takes 15 to 20 years. So you have to give us a lead time. You have to handhold us, and then we'll get there. The classic example being the LCA aircraft projects, the Air Force's projections versus what we can produce, till political intervention came in and told the IAF, you have no choice, but you have to absorb what is being made in India. So I think we are seeing a strategic shift within the country, and the coming years will tell us that if we are going to finally turn the corner in terms of defense production, its acquisition internally, and its exports externally. But thank you very much for your wisdom, and thanks for all your inputs. And I'm sure this is a matter of debate which will continue for some time. Thanks for watching. Until our next episode, goodbye.